Hello, and many thanks for joining us on this edition of the program People, Politics and Power. I am Imoni Amarere. Nigeria is just months away from the 2023 general elections. Expectedly, Politicking, with all its concomitant attachments, have kicked into place and have, in fact, taken the front row in the scheme of things. One of such accompanying phenomena is the volume and quality of information that is being dished out to the public. Accurate, credible, and genuine information dissemination is a key component of any democratic process. To do otherwise could jeopardize and in fact endanger democracy itself. At present, there is a plague of disinformation and misinformation running riot across the country, ostensibly for political gains and advantages. Hardly a minute goes by without a piece of false, misleading, or concocted information being put out there, especially in the social media space, designed to malign, to bruise, to tarnish the character of individuals or entities, and to spread influence and influence public opinion, or to obscure the truth in some cases. It is simply called politics, the Nigerian way. Now, globally, disinformation has come to be seen as one of the defining issues of our time, spread and amplified by social media and fueled by anti-establishment rhetoric, which creates a demand for a so-called alternative narrative. Some media scholars argue that the disinformation problem is driven to a large extent by wider structural faults in each country's political system. Now, while others say it is driven partly by commercial and profit motivations. What is, however, not in dispute is that disinformation has the potential to alter civic engagement and hijack democracy by influencing individuals towards a particular way of thinking, repeating what is regarded as the big lies, false narratives, and putting a spin on words, actions, and events that can persuade susceptible people to dangerous ideas and eventually alter the course of a nation's historical trajectory. On the program today, we shall interrogate the sources, the forms, the motives, and the growing complexity of disinformation and the implications for our democracy. How can the media, as an enabler of democracy, protect the ideals of democracy and not be used to demonize or destroy it? Join me and my guests, who are media scholars and, of course, media professionals, as we dig deep into this issue. We'll be back right after now. Thank you so much for staying with us. I'm joined in the studio at this point in time by Professor Abiodun Adeniyi. Professor Adeniyi is the head of the Mass Communications Department at Bayes University here in the nation's capital. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We'll also be joined very shortly via Zoom by Igo Akerega. Igo is the Abuja Bureau Chief of This Nigeria newspaper. He'll be joining us in a moment. Professor Abiodun Adeniyi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's begin by our understanding of the role the media plays in a democratic process.
Well, of course, we know the media is one of these very strong pillars of democracy, for providing information, the oxygen through which education, awareness, and of course, entertainment, to some extent, is lubricated in every system. Without the media, of course, there will be darkness. Without the media, there won't be understanding. And democracy thrives in understanding mutual appreciation of thoughts, the strengthening of thoughts, and the ability for those thoughts to be processed into ideas and action, to that extent, you will say, of course, I don't want to belabor us with the often repeated cliche that media is the forte state of the realm. It has even gone beyond that to be the major interrogator of all the segments in the trinity of a democratic system, and that trinity is represented in the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. The media is capacitated to interrogate their functionality, and of course, in situations where they are faltering, the media's role is to call them to order. So the media is at once a watchdog, and at the same time, a monitor, like a judge, so to say. Yes, we may not appropriate that role to ourselves, but we act as judges, because we are representing the society beyond the constituents. On behalf of the constituents, the media is the armor bearer, for the constituents that the politicians, the elected officials represent. The media come in between, acting for the civil society, and of course, to some extent, protecting the rights of the leaders, as the case could be. So the media's role is central, and there's no system really that downplay the role of the media, except those that are dictatorial. And even in an atmosphere of dictatorship, there's still pretense to accommodating the media in a controlled format, which underlines the fact that, whether in dictatorship or in a democracy, you still have to privilege, the dissemination of information, because dissemination is an oxygen. It lubricates the entire system. And of course, if information is not there, there's going to be a fundamental problem. And that's why it will continue. It has remained significant in history, and that's why it will continue to be very, very important, irrespective of the explosion we're having in information dissemination, and because of the instrumentality of new media of communication, brought about by the internet technology.
Yeah, so there's no doubt that the media is critical, like you put it, as being the oxygen
That's right.
of a democracy.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, the media is the medium through which information is disseminated to a larger audience, larger
right.
body and public audience now. So now, in disseminating that information, what are those critical elements? What are those very salient ethical issues that need to be observed?
Yeah, do you know, the media's role is one of the most critical roles, not just understood in philosophy, but also well understood in the Constitution. And that's why the role of the media is expressly stated in our Constitution, information dissemination. But there's no responsibility, there's no duty, no assignment that does not come with some level of responsibility. And what is the responsibility of the media? To be accurate, evidence-based, to be objective as much as possible, and not to malign. And that's why we have rules guiding us, There's something we call media law, which reminds us of some of our rights and responsibilities. Yes, we have these rights, we have these privileges, but they shouldn't be abused in the interest to protect the sanity of the system, because that sanity is also very, very important. You have the license to report, you are obliged by the Constitution and by the expectation of the people and the constituents, as the case could be, but at the same time, you are not supposed to abuse it. So there are some basic ethics, and that ethic is centers around evidence-based reporting, objectivity, and of course exhaustion, so that you not leave the reader in doubt. And if you do not have to indulge in excessive opinionating, allow the listeners or the viewers or the readers to make up their mind. These are the basic expectations. But of course, we also acknowledge the fact that those expectations, those duties are being obfuscated, if not undermined, because of the explosion we are having in information and communication technologies, and of course in the pluralization of channels, such that control has become very, very difficult. And this is a tension that is going on between the old and the new media. The traditional mainstream media are still disposed to keeping this ethical orientation. But of course, the new media has brought about a system where all citizens, no matter their exposure, are licensed to parrot or to mimic the work of the media. And of course, most of the time, they lack the knowledge. They lack the knowledge of the basic ethics that you're supposed to subscribe to, which has led to the emergence of closet nymphomaniacs, people who just do mischief from the corners of their houses, of their offices, of their rooms, only because they possess the smartphone. And do not forget also, the fact that the social media is so plural and even expanding beyond the popular ones, Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, etc., etc. So this gives advantage to a multiplicity of people, to parody the work of the media. But it does not detract the fact that detract us from the fact that there can still be sanity, if the traditional variants, are consistent with the principles that they earlier subscribed to, and the ethics expected of them. How do you deal with pluralization of media and the flurry of misinformation that is in the system? You deal with it through, by coming up with not just media literacy. Media literacy may be long term, but you come up with, facts that will counter, the one that seems to be mischievous. The mischief makers are there. They've always been there in history. Maybe we'll get to that at some point.
Yes, I was going to get to that almost immediately. Okay. This mischief media, is it a global phenomenon? Or is just something that is more common with underdeveloped countries or developing countries?
Very good question, Mark. The question of mischief is not just limited to contemporary times. It's a historical phenomenon. Do not forget today we lionize Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato as the forerunners of knowledge. While they existed, there was also tension, in what was actually knowledgeable. There was tension between the truth and falsehood, and the tension around truth has also continued. Of course, one of them was even stoned to death because the truth that he was projecting was said to be falsehood, until much later in life where we started appreciating what they brought, their contributions to knowledge. And of course, fast forward again to about the 15th century, when we had somebody called the Bard of Avon, William Shakespeare. He came up with so much literature that we admire today, and of course, some more years in the future, we're still going to continue to admire it. But some 500 years later, those publications were disputed, on the ground that he wasn't actually the writer of those literature. And remember Karl Marx. Karl Marx came up with a variant of truth. Capitalism was dominant, but he challenged it, saying that, capitalism is inherently faulty. And what did it lead to? Of course, it led to the rise of communist states, socialist states, and even it led to the reformation of capitalism. And that's why we have some elements of welfarism in some capitalist states, an injection of care and welfarism into even some ultra-capitalist bastion of capitalist states like the United States of America. So there's a way in which, the truth and falsehood rub off with each other such that, the truth pays attention to what is perceived as falsehood, and it leads to development. And that's why there's a dialectics between right and wrong, between truth and justice, between judgment and justice, between any shade of opinion or perception you want to align with. So the fundamental point here is that there will always be misinformation, there will always be disinformation, and there will always be malinformation. What matters is how you manage one aspect of it. And sometimes, I've also hinted at it, it's not all the time that these elements are bad, Sometimes it's a wake-up call. Sometimes it brings about the need for you to expand your own truth, provide for that justification, and it leads to development, as the case could be. Development in terms of knowledge and understanding, and you are eventually helping the populace, to be able to also align with you, leading to third-party validation of your own truth. Because if you don't make me to believe in you, through the provision of information, through the media, then how well will I be able to internalize the fact that you are trying to throw to me? How well will I be able to appreciate you and believe in you? The tension will continue, just as it is continuing now. But what do? Provide more information to counter it. And we are saying in modern times that media literacy is the key. If you cannot provide a good structural education for the citizen, as we are deficient in the developed countries, back to your question, then provide immediate media literacy. In the wake of COVID-19, of course, there was what is it WHO or UNESCO called infodemic. There were lots of falsehood, but what did they do? They didn't rest on that. Was they provided counter information to correct all threads of information that amounted to falsehood. They were false. Let me say something finally, Mark. It's not cheap. Information dissemination is not cheap. Communication is not cheap. But in our own system, in the developing world, we think that it's a budget head that should not be paid attention to. No ministry, nowhere will you see a budget outlay, for instance, and you see provision for communication or for media information dissemination. It's often at the backstage, and that's why we have so much misunderstanding, so much distrust, and that's why you continue to have this huge gap, trust deficit between the leaders and the led, because information dissemination is largely undermined. The media communication aspects of our structures is largely undermined. This is something that needs to be corrected if we want to manage that matrix very well.
All right. Well, we understand that Igor Akerega has joined us now, but before we go to Igor, let me quickly ask this. There are media scholars who try to distinguish between disinformation and misinformation, as well as even fake news. Where does the difference lie? Where is the connection, or where do they have a meeting point?
Yeah. You see, there's only a third element to it. Malinformation, and the fourth element is the one that just came in the wake of the COVID, which is infodemic. But misinformation, they are all about. If you want to look at it, maybe throw it to the layperson with due respect, you will say they are the same thing. They just amount to falsehood, but it depends on the context. It depends on the context in which you are using it. Disinformation, for instance, is that you know the truth, but you are deliberately putting a spin to it to create confusion. Misinformation, again, is not too far. You know the truth, you are throwing in falsehood to achieve some selfish ends. But malinformation happens even at institutional level, where governments or agencies deliberately hide the truth because they just assume that if you release the truth, the entire truth, it will be damaging. Or you throw what appears to be falsehood at another institution because you want to damage that institution. I will give you an example. Of course, malinformation comes up mostly in cases of conflict between Russia and Ukraine, for instance. At the time, it was difficult to know what was the truth, because, we're hearing reports about how the Russian defense was obliterated by the Ukrainian. But of course, we know there's element of propaganda in these things. Malinformation is close to propaganda, no doubt, but I'll come to this shortly. But between disinformation and misinformation, they are often tailored towards achieving some selfish end, but they thrive on falsehood, and it's often deliberate. But again, you cannot condemn everything, because in warfare, in conflict, if you release everything that is factual about yourself, you may likely be endangering yourself and empowering the enemy. That's what it is really. And of course, propaganda has been proven by different scholars. There is not all kinds of propaganda that is essentially bad. Although people like Adolf Hitler, through demagoguery, have given a bad name to propaganda. But largely, it's not all kinds of propaganda that is definitely bad. Just some part of it can be good. Sometimes you can relate it to spin doctoring. And of course, you cannot say spin doctoring is completely wrong. Imagine what happens in government every day. In a sane, ideal government. It is not everything that happens in government that you release to the public. If government officials, in a sane and ideal situation, are discussing an issue, for instance, they are not likely to reveal all the processes, that led to the conclusion they arrive at. At the end of the day, they just come with the conclusion. They're not likely to give you all the details, what led to it. Because if they give you all the details, it will lead to a trifle, sometimes confusion. People will interpret it in different ways. And when there's differentiated interpretation, it leads to a problem at the end of the day. That's why bringing in the Pareto rule that says that at the end of the day, there will be a conclusion. And that conclusion will likely be arrived at by a few people, That's the nature of systems and society, and it cannot necessarily be different, irrespective of the downsides of misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, and the new one, infodemic.
All right, let's turn to Igor Akerega. Igor, thank you so much for joining us. There are those who think, Igor, for instance, that politics seems to breed a pandemic of disinformation, of misinformation, and in some cases outright fakery of the news. Is this a correct interpretation? Is it just politics, or indeed any other situation can breed disinformation, misinformation, and fake news?
Well, good afternoon.
Igor, can you hear us?
Good to be with you on the other phone. Hello, can you hear me?
Igor, you need to unmute so that we can hear you here in the studio.
Oh, good
You
afternoon.
need to unmute your microphone so that we can hear you.
It's okay. If I get your question correctly, basically there are other forms of situations that can engender disinformation and misinformation. But basically, in my view, and from my experience as a journalist, politics and political experiences, particularly the players of the political system, have a way of trying to push through their political message contents in such a way that they do not tell all the truth. They do not disclose everything that is in their mind. And then, of course, once they get elected into political offices, they do things that is at variance with their promises. And so the media then tries to remind them that what they are saying is at variance with what they promise the people. So when people talk about fake news sometimes, it is not always fake news. There is a correlation between fake news and the truth. Sometimes when the media publishes the truth about a particular situation, the purveyor of that information, which is the media, is sometimes accused of spreading fake news. The political class is very impatient with media content, particularly if it has to do with unveiling the truth. And so they are the ones who come to bandy this idea of fake news. If you remember the current dispensation when the Minister of Information and the government tries to push through the media regulatory laws that essentially wants to address the issues of fake news. Yes, there's fake news in the media domain or in the public domain, but it is more prevalent with social media and citizen journalism, more prevalent with those who are not professionals. But as a professional journalist, there are basic ingredients of news and information that must be available before you can publish or go to the public space. So in the traditional media and of course online media platform that is managed and run by professionals, the advent or the issue of fake news is very limited. So yes, it plays quite a dominant role. Disinformation, the very essence of disinformation in public information management itself has to do with how you perceive the issues. If are you intending to push propaganda content? If you are pushing propaganda content, then of course that falls within the realm of clear disinformation and pushing out misleading information. But the media has a clear role to always, there's usually a big load of information before us, and we have a duty to decipher which is which and what should be available to the public. So essentially, that is what it is. It does also, if you talk about disinformation, you want to relate it to democratic stability or to the sustenance and deepening of the democratic process. Yes, if a particular regime or administration is in place and it is not performing, it becomes a bad product. And so the only way that administration can survive in their own mindset, in their own small world, is to continue to push out disinformation to mislead the people. Basically, disinformation is to disempower the people from knowing the truth, pushing out information that the people doesn't need, that can mislead the people. So you try to just manipulate the mindsets of those that are led. That is, the political class has a tendency of doing that all the time, and they disinform people deliberately in a way to sustain themselves or to manage their own particular political reputation. So for the discerning media, it's usually a thin line to walk, and that's where investigative journalism comes in. When information comes out, content is pushed out, how do you verify what is true and what is not true? This is the role of investigative journalism.
All right, Prof, let me come back to you here in the studio. There are media scholars who have argued, for instance, that the disinformation problem that we seem to have on our hands globally, and but particularly so in developing democracies, is driven by wider structural political systems that are faulty, the structural faults that exist in the political system of individual countries.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think I believe you to. I believe them to a very large extent, but it's not to say that there are no elements of disinformation even in sophisticated democracies. Of course, the question of fake news originated from Donald Trump, who thought that most of the ways he was portrayed, he was being portrayed were actually wrong. So he just termed it fake news, and the thing started trending, and it stuck, in the definition of untruth, But of course, do not forget the debate around post-truth as well, an age where you find it occasionally very difficult to know what to believe. And the solution, like I said, it's education. In those sophisticated countries, of course, there's greater level of awareness, greater level of education, so there's increased ability to discern. Discernment is very, very key. But in our own case, of course, there's less education, many people are illiterate, they thrive on rumor, and of course, they even enjoy rumor much more than the truth. In fact, sometimes they see it as entertaining. You need to see how people who are illiterate, how they represent facts, sometimes how they describe public officials, how they are fighting, how they are fighting over each other's wife, becomes very laughable. They bring it to the pedestrian level. It's not necessarily their fault, it's the level of education. And those kind of people, if you throw any information into their midst, they believe it's hook, line, and sinker. So if there's a level of awareness through education, it can help remedy the situation. But in the absence of that, is what we've been advocating, media literacy. Media literacy is in evidence in many of these sophisticated countries, and it helps in strengthening the institutions. But how do we deal with our own, really? Of course, we cannot deny the fact that individuals sometimes try to manipulate information to suit them, because if you do not manipulate it, put spin, I beg your pardon, to some facts, of course, it will amount to self-deprecation, as if you are undermining yourself. So it's about complex, it's about ego, it's about pride. But again, that does not show courage. What is important is actually the courage to admit the truth, portray the truth, come out transparently in the spirit of accountability. Because the people are not necessarily dumb, they can appreciate you, desire you. But again, back to education, the ability for them to understand, appreciate you is a function of their own level of exposure too. But that exposure can be provided in the immediate term, in the short term, through media literacy, and in the long term, through functional, structural, solid education that will ensure that a lot more people are educated than we presently have. That's what I think in the media.
I will ask you this question, and I also want some response from Igor. Can disinformation be an organized enterprise, or is it an organized enterprise? Does it have some commercial motives to it?
Well, it depends on how one looks at it. Disinformation can directly have commercial motive. It depends on who is pushing it out. First, I must quickly inform you that I'm seeing on the news bar that I'm Abuja Bureau Chief of This Nigerian newspaper. I have since left this Nigeria. I'm now editor-in-chief at the Democrat newspaper online. Okay, so having said that, usually for disinformation to occur, it must be preconceived. It must be preconceived, it must be planned. It's like public relations. It is also a branch of propaganda, as I would put it, because there is an intended objective for the message that is being pushed out, that is seeking to mislead the audience. So sometimes it has commercial motive. That is when a group of people are paid, like you have people who go on Twitter, they just have politicians actually do that. They get some group of people together, pay them, and ask them to push out negative information deliberately misinform the people. That's a clear case of disinformation with commercial motivation. The other one basically may not have direct monetary or commercial motivation, but it seeks to strengthen the position of the benefactor of the information. In this case, maybe a politician who knows, for example, that he does not stand a chance with the electorate, but he's then um, pushing out message content that portrays him as the best, the most credible option out of the lot, when he or she knows that most of the information is pushing out falls within the realm of falsehood. And once they are verified, you just find that they fall flat like a pack of cards. So in that sense, it does not have direct commercial motives, but it only seeks to strengthen the position or strengthen the reputation of the beneficiary of that information. So it just depends on the environment where disinformation is being cooked, is being prepared, is being dished out to the people. Those who organize themselves to get involved in this kind of information. Well, like we also know, information is very powerful. It's a powerful tool. For the first receivers of information that is not correct, they may not be available to listen to the correct version. And that is why often it is also termed as fake news. Because once it is not correct, then it is fake news. It's an incorrect information. How do you deal with this kind of situation? Maybe by regulation. I listened to Professor Adin cite example of former U.S. President Donald Trump, who actually most times deliberately misinformed the American public. Yes, using all the instrumentalities of whether it is Twitter, Facebook, and all that. He was very active on Twitter. And some of the figures he even read out while he was in government, when it was subjected to verification, people just found that they were not really correct. It happens in Nigeria here too, our own country, where you have high-ranking government officials will push out figures deliberately targeted at misinforming the people. And then the media, often when they interrogate these figures, they just find that they are not correct. So it has all kinds of values. It depends on who is behind the messages that is being pushed out.
Mm. So, Prof,
Yeah.
that question comes back to you. Is it possible, or does it exist, that the enterprise or disinformation can be an organized enterprise, either for commercial purposes or indeed for any other motives?
Yeah, definitely they can be. Maybe we should stay away from politics and look at business. Business concerns can actually embark on it and to gain the competitive edge over their rivals. And to demarket their competitors. It is possible, and of course there are people who are specialists in this. They won't see it as such. They will just see it as the execution of a professional mandate. To demarket, defame, deliberately defame, and of course it's possible these times to do it through cross-posting, multiple posting, through anonymity, using the platform of the internet, the social media. Of course, these things can be done. So for that, you could say the motive is commercial. You want to undersell your competitor and, of course, outsell them for profit, for profit sharing. It's possible, but the question again is that, is it moral? Is it ethical? You may say in some questions may be asked around whether there's morality or ethics in business. Of course, I know there should be, but to what extent do practitioners obey this? But in the realm of politics, actually, disinformation is actually largely unreasonable. It shouldn't be acceptable because you are holding forth for the people. You are standing in on behalf of the people, and as a leader, you should be associated with transparency and accountability, not to misinform or disinform people, The people are just there. Don't forget that they are vulnerable. They look up to you. They are trusting in you. They have given you their mandate. They have entrusted it into you, consistent with the prescriptions of the Leviathan. You are representing the state. So the onus is largely on you, to serve them very well. And one way in which you can serve them is to come clean. Do not undermine their intelligence. If you bruise the intelligence of people, you undermine their ego, it can be much more painful, than even physical offenses. When you bruise the intelligence of people, and that's what we find politicians doing most of the time. Taking the intelligence of people for granted. And thinking that they cannot discern. And by the time they're able to discern these things, they see through you. They know that you are a harbinger of falsehood, and it affects your credibility and reputation. And one thing any human being should preserve, not just politicians, is your reputation, your credibility, and your integrity, so that they can be trusted. And of course, one permanent tension that exists between the governed and the government is trust. And whatever you can do to build this is very, very important. And one way to do it is to avoid misinformation or disinforming them.
Now, in other words, you are saying that disinformation, and in fact, the way it has been proliferated in many societies these days, can make very many people, individuals, to lose faith in politics, to lose faith in political institutions, to lose faith in political processes, and even lose faith in governmental institutions.
Of course, it can. One thing that people don't understand, this is maybe, it has to do with psychology of communication, for instance. People think that, if you come priding yourself, if you come lionizing yourself, pretending to be immaculate, playing God, that it will help you therefore. No. If you come clean, come ordinary, come your natural self, as plain as possible, people, you will now be more opportune to discern, to see through you, and probably even love you more. Not necessarily to tell lies, because when they see through those lies, everything about it just falls, like Igor said, like a pack of cards. They see through it, and they begin to disrespect you thereafter. But the onus is always, there are examples that we can cite around the world, people who come clean, who come natural. It's unfortunate that we're going to go back to Donald Trump, for instance. It's very unpopular with respect to people who subscribe to the ideal. But of course, it's also very popular among people who like him for his naturalness. Do they see him very he can be very brash, he can be very uncivil, very discourteous, but there are people who just like him for being natural, irrespective of the downside. Ironically, is coming in as an example, but there are also people, let's come back home now, look at the Osun election. There are arguments in circles that Adeleke won, not because of the party he belongs to, but because of his personality. They just see him as a very natural person, somebody who's not necessarily esoteric, who is just there. He comes out natural, and of course, can be very entertaining. We're not asking you to be entertaining, but just be yourself. And how do you be yourself? By telling the truth. Just come as you are. Even the Almighty says, come as you are. Don't be hypocritical. By the time you are hypocritical and people see through it, of course, you are likely to be disrespected. It's a psychological aspect of communication that people tend to undermine, but it's very, very important.
So, Igor, how much of that can we find in our societies today? How much of the loss of faith in institutions, in processes, and possibly in governance can we find in our societies today as a result of disinformation?
Well, as resources begin to shrink, as opportunities become so limited, the tendency to misinform people across different strata of society takes root. Even at the family level, you have parents that are not responsible. And so to try to prove to their children or the rest of the family members that they are responsible, they try to push out information, they misinform members of they disinform them. Another way to look at it is to strip people of the power of correct or factual information. When you deliberately strip people of that power, of the ability to respond to what they perceive as the appropriate information, that is clearly a disinformation. Yes, to a very large extent, it is prevalent across MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies of government. You want facts, you want information from them. What do? They just say, oh, what you have come to ask for is not true. This is the true position. That is to preserve the rest, preserve, lawyers call it the rest, the facts and all of that, preserve the status quo, then to serve some kind of, abstract master somewhere. So all of these are all combinative efforts that seems to undermine even the essence of democracy itself. Because democracy is supposed to strengthen societal institutions, galvanize development and growth. But when information that is supposed to be supportive, that is correct information that is supposed to be supportive, play a key and dominant role in strengthening the organ of democracy is deliberately undermined by people who have the responsibility to speak the truth, then of course it has an adverse effect on society. So at community level and at different strata of society, you have individuals who who now have some kind of loyalty to disinformation. But as Professor Adeni also said, it is very important to preserve self-respect, to preserve your reputation. Because over time, once people realize that whatever you say cannot be trusted, then you are in trouble. It is worse for institutions of state and government. For example, I would like to cite the example of the police force. Police forces around the world, particularly the police force in Nigeria, if they issue a statement, including the military itself, it would appear as if they already have a template. Whatever happens, they just change the date, change a few scenarios, and put it there, just to give the impression that they are responding to what has happened. But those ones does not really contain the facts. So they deliberately disinform the public, disinform people. So to that extent, it weakens the institutions and the pillars of states, such that once people lose confidence, whatever you say, even when you begin to speak the truth, you want to push out the correct information, people have they've lost interest. And once interest is lost, it becomes a huge problem. The case of the Independent National Electoral Commission is also very handy. You know, in the past, you find many voters, many Nigerians believing that their votes cannot count. You know, why? Because once they cast their ballots, they then discover that the candidates that emerge are not people that are usually preferred. So INEC will try to explain what has happened in the process. Either they will say, oh, candidates have failed, something has happened. But behind the scene, perhaps other things would have happened. So whatever information they are pushing to the public at that point, it becomes, it can then be interpreted as a deliberate effort at disinformation. So all of these create for institutions of society and the community.
Now,
So
as someone who is in the human rights community, how do you think that disinformation helps to undermine human rights?
Oh, sorry, I didn't get that. Please repeat that.
Now, for someone like you who is in the human rights community, for instance, how does disinformation or misinformation undermine human rights?
Yes, that is a big challenge for us in the civil society movement. You know, most cases that we have to deal with has to do with cases of human rights violation. And for those who violate human rights, you don't expect them to tell you the truth. For example, law enforcement agents, they brutalize citizens, they do all kinds of things that are outside their powers as law enforcement officers. And so when you take on them, you know, they of course, they need to defend themselves. They come out with all kinds of potpourri of lies. So it's a big challenge. And sometimes you even want to engage government agencies, particularly in the areas of transparency and accountability in the utilization of public resources. The information that always comes out does not represent the truth or does not stand as the truth. So it then poses a huge challenge to people in the human rights community. But that has not discouraged us. We keep pushing. And one thing we must all realize is that people will tell you that Nigeria is a throttling democracy. Though I disagree, but I am sure gradually, with consistency, with force on the part of everyone, people in the human rights community have not given up. And you can see the results with the Petroleum Industry Act that was signed by President Buhari, and of course also the 2020 Electoral Act that now guarantees electronic transmission of results and the use of the beavers and all of that. So gradually we are building the blocks of democracy. The civil society organizations are doing their very best. You can see in different areas, thematic areas that they have assigned to themselves, they are delivering, and I'm sure maybe some hope is in the offing. Sometime from now, somewhere along the line, we are going to get it right.
All right, thank you, Iwo. Let me come to you, Prof, and,
Yeah.
and to see that it appears that in form and content, disinformation is getting more complex.
Yeah.
And in fact, with greater resort to technology, is becoming a behemoth, so to say.
That's right.
Now, how does society, or how should society engage with this? How do we curb the further spread of disinformation, of misinformation, and ensure that it does not negatively impact democratic processes?
There's something that we need to underline, Mark. The ability to express yourself is also a route to happiness, to satisfaction, to the boosting of self-esteem. The citizen feel a sense of involvement and inclusion when he's able to express him or herself. So it's a hallmark of democracy. Let's not undermine that. But the problem comes, where the expression of yourself is negative or tends to be destructive. And that's where the law should come in. There's no system that should not operate with law. That's where the law should come in. That's why regulation should come in a situation where you cannot take responsibility in the way the legitimate media would do. There are many reasons in which we restrict ourselves, for instance, in which we guard ourselves, if not because of organizational expectations, but because of our own training, our own understanding. But the average person who is now empowered to also express himself may not feel that obligation, so he can unleash damage. And that's why the state can move in, and bring about a check. How have we been able to do that effectively? Therein lies the problem again. But again, it's not to say you do not also have to help the citizen. That citizen that is trying to express himself to make him happy, but is now abusing it. You first of all try to help him through education. Let him have understanding. But after that understanding, whether on the short or the long term, through media literacy or through formal education, if he's now failing, then of course sanction, apprehension, prosecution and sanction will now come in. That's why the way you can bring people to check. But to say that we can completely eliminate disinformation is like saying that a society can exist without crime. It's absolutely not impossible. But what you would do is to minimize it, mitigate it, manage it such that it does not become the norm, so that however it is, the truth, the evidence-based report, fact-based reports will always overwhelm the untruth, or falsehoods that sections of the populace will still be disposed to perpetrating. It's very difficult for us to avoid it completely, because they just think they're expressing themselves. I do not forget that they're human beings, we are different. Even among the educated, forget it, even among the educated, sometimes they are prone to the release of disadvantageous information or harmful information among the education because of the
unverified information.
Unverified information. So it's not just about, we also have to underline that fact, In that case, the law should come in. Do not forget we have traditional laws of libel, laws of slander, and all of that, How well are we activating it? In some other climes, these things have been activated well, They have online policemen, they keep monitoring these things. If you try to pass information that can be injurious, of course, there are ways in which you can be traced, what do they call it? There are so many of this technology that they also master. They can trace cybersecurity. It's very, 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 very efficient in those climes, There's nothing wrong with it. The society is growing, is becoming plural, becoming much more sophisticated in terms of technology. That's a welcome development. It's a hallmark of the 21st century, and we are even growing. You cannot even tell the extent to which communication will go, and it's continuing to grow every day. Every 6 months, your gadget is outdated. Those things is going to continue because capitalism is advancing, and we are enjoying it to some extent. But we need to pay attention to the downside as well. But in paying attention to the downside, we need to also be mindful of regulations, of laws that will not necessarily detract from the advantage, the benefits that this pluralization has brought into humankind.
Well, You look at some of these other climes, particularly the developed societies or countries of the world that you made reference to, and you see that so much of what goes on right here in Nigeria or indeed in many other developing countries have been taken care of in terms of disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation, as you put it. Now, how did they go about that? Where and when are we likely to get to that stage?
It takes, very fantastic question, but it takes a lot. And it comes back to what you raised earlier on, with the problem with our institutions, our political structures. Our political structures, our institutions are still very weak. They are not strong enough. We have a situation where the human wish, the human preferences still override the institutions. The institutions are still very weak. And that's why we keep talking about strengthening the institutions, so that, our legacies can be better preserved. Institution is a main pillar around systems and societies operate, whether abstract or actual. When we say abstract, we're talking about institutions like the law, for instance. When we say actual, we're talking about physical structures and the human beings that man it. If these things are well structured in such a way that the rules and regulations guide them, such that man does not rule, so that the preference of the human being, of the leader, does not override that of the institution, then you can see progress. Then you can see our ability to deal with some of these little things, some of these criminal acts, like disinformation and misinformation. But in a situation where everything is done to please individuals, then it becomes much more problematic. These sophisticated countries, developed countries have grown, their institutions have grown. Remember, finally, Mark, if it was not for the institutions, the machinations, the trajectories of Donald Trump will have hurt the American state. But for the strength of the institutions, it was able to withstand his machinations, as the case could be.
Thank you so much, Professor Abiodun Adeniyi, head Mass Communications Department at Base University here in the nation's capital, Abuja. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And of course, we're joined online virtually by Igor Akerega. Igor is the editor-in-chief of Democrat newspaper online. Thank you so much, Igor, for your time. And for you, the viewer out there, we want to thank you for investing your time with us.
Thank you very much.
Took a look at.
It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Great to have you on, Igor. We've looked at disinformation and the impact it has on the growth of democracy in any society, and particularly so in our society, Nigeria. Thank you and goodbye.